Okay, so good morning. We were going to do introductions, so we'll probably just maybe skip that because I think we know we've all met, right? We've all done this. Okay, good. So I think the point of today is to talk about, make sure that we understand and share understanding about what changed in Missouri law this year and what are the impacts of that moving forward. So we'll start with a brief grounding. I'll very quickly explain sort of context for the Ashrei Foundation. Those of us in the room, I think already know who we are, but we'll do that briefly. And then I want to dig into some of the details about House Bill 1878, which became law earlier this year. Then we'll talk a little bit about responses to that. I'll touch briefly on the new lawsuits that were filed to counter that legislation. And then certainly we'll talk about the photo ID clinics as one of the responses, and then we'll kind of finish up with some next steps. So with that, I will pass to you for a bit of grounding.
A little bit of ground. So I really don't think, Pastor Andre, we've had a chance to, just, so I'm going to use this time, if that's okay, just to connect with you. That's all right. So
we'll just watch.
I came to St. Louis right out of seminary in 1981 with my husband. We took a sharing job in the county, and pretty quickly I realized that's not why I became a rabbi, was to serve in the suburbs. So after I finished the contract in 3 years, we weren't going to be out of here, but I started having babies, and he took another job, so we kind of got stuck. But I was not going to stay. My experience was coming out of New York City, where I grew up. This was foreign to me. Even though my first congregation was in Jackson, Tennessee, where I really loved it because everything was out in the open. Here, the racism that was so. It was like I couldn't figure out what was going on here. Was this a southern place? It was like there was a veil. There was a veil of pretension that was really disturbing. So as I was kind of stuck here, I took a job teaching at SLU, having babies, and a group of 30 people came to me and said, we want to start a congregation, white flight. Everybody else is moving to the suburbs. We want a commitment to the city. I said, that's for me. So we thought we would just have this small little community of people who wanted to commit to the city of St. Louis and face the issues. It was the early 80s, so AIDS epidemic was huge. Do we make a space for people dying of AIDS who had no place to go, especially the Jews, no place to go to say the mourner's prayers because most people had been thrown out of their families? So we started with that mission, to be pro-choice, to be pro-queer, a place for the gay community, and to make a place for Jews of color, because quickly I realized you could be black or you could be Jewish in St. Louis. You couldn't be both, right? And you couldn't choose not to be black, so you had to choose not to be Jewish. So I said, okay, if we can make this our focus, we'll start a community, which is what we did in 1984.
A fine year, by the way. Some of us were brought to this world in 1984.
Right, and so my daughter Sarika was also born that year. So I had a baby and I birthed the congregation in 1984.
Wow.
And for 16 years we were in the church across the street from us in the First Unitarian Church. We call it our mothership. They made a space for us until we got so big, we got bigger than them. And so this piece of land became available to us across the street. We really put down roots when we built our building. We're over 800 households now, so we're a few thousand people. People said, nobody's going to come to the city's going to die, people aren't going to want to come. Well, they were wrong. In fact, my generation, the baby boomer generation, we're moving back to the city because we don't want our kids driving us around. And we're sick and tired of the suburbs and those values, right? We want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. So we really have a pretty dynamic congregation. And so every week we study another portion of the Torah. The Torah for us is the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Then, of course, our Bible includes the prophets and the writings too. For us, that's the Bible. Christians call that the Old Testament. We don't call it the Old Testament because it's our only one. So we call it the Hebrew Scriptures or the Bible. And every week we study another portion. Right now we're moving through the book of Deuteronomy. And the portion today is Ki Tetzei. When you go to war. When you go to war? Not if you go to war, but when you go to war. So the rabbis say, wait a minute, is that a comment on human nature? There's always going to be violence, there's always going to be war? And that's the question. The very last part of the portion is the story of Amalek. Amalek is quintessential evil. Why? Because when we left Egypt, we left that narrow place, we left slavery, it's not like we got to pack up and take, our stuff with us. We left, we had been slaves for 400 years. We were a mess. We were tired, we were weary, but we knew we had to be strategic in the wilderness. So we positioned ourselves, and this is all in the Torah, right? We put the strong people in the front to protect the weak and the elderly and the sick in the back. And what did Amalek do? Amalek attacked from behind. So he became the symbol of people who don't play by the rules, people who are so subhuman that they let their evil inclination overcome. And those are the people that make sure, Ki Tetzei, that there will always be war, there will always be violence, because those are the rules they play by. So what do we have between Ki Tetzei and Amalek? What do you have between these two things? You have 72 rules in this portion, 72 laws. Now, they're not the laws about praying 3 times a day or keeping kosher or those kinds of things. We have those laws. But these 72 laws between those two things are all about the soul. They say that, Ki Tetzei, when you go to war and you take a captive, you have to treat that captive with dignity. Imagine that. The person who was trying to kill you, you treat them with dignity. Ki Tetzei, when, you have to not muzzle an ox. Because if you muzzle an ox in the field, it's cruel. Its nature is to eat. If you're out and you see your neighbor's ox and your friend's ox and they've gotten loose, you have to return your neighbor's ox first. You have to leave the corners of your field because they don't really belong to you. They belong to the poor, because the poor should never be hungry, right? And we all live on this earth together. These are the rules. There's even a law in those 72 that says if your children are hungry and you need to feed them, and you see a nest and there are baby birds or maybe even eggs in that nest, you can't take them if the mother bird is watching, because you can't cause suffering even to the mother bird. So we know that those 72 laws, they are not just about doing the right thing and relieving suffering to the most vulnerable. They're about shaping the soul so that when we are faced with this violence that seems inevitable and Amalek, evil, we are doing what we can to shape the soul with your password, compassion. Because what we believe is that everybody has a Yetzer Hara and a Yetzer HaTov, a good inclination and a not so good inclination. And religion, what we're doing here, is to exercise the good inclination, so that in moments where we're challenged, we respond in the holiest of ways. And this is what Moses says to the people just before we go into the land. This is what Moses says to the people at the end of Deuteronomy, because Moses knows he's not going into the land with the people, and they better get it right, or we're going to suffer again and again. So I was going to do an exercise with grounding and bringing the worlds together, but we don't need to do that today. All we need to know is that our teachings, what we do here, And the fact that this is a holy place, a place where there's worship, as well as providing health care, as well as providing banking, as well as providing, right, all the things, food, right? All the things that you do, and providing and preserving the right to vote. We know that Amalek today, we know who they are. They're the people that are trying to silence black and brown people from voting. We know that's what they're trying to do because they are afraid of the browning of America, and they are willing to die for their whiteness. And so we have to partner. We have to partner. Those of us who see this clearly, we have to partner so that Amalek doesn't win in St. Louis.
No, you're absolutely right. I have a friend who's on staff at a fairly large church in Chesapeake, and it's predominantly white. And this was last year, they were having this conversation around, I forgot the title of it. In essence, it was about race and relationships. And one of the members of the church that he didn't know, older white guy, said to him, basically, you don't think we'll just easily give up all that power to you? He said, tell me more about this. In essence, what this guy was saying was that they feared numbers, like he said, the browning of America. Because then if I lose numbers, I lose power. So how can I control numbers? I take away stuff that does not allow you to create and shape policy, which drives everything, right?
Yes.
Including monetary policy, which was the next thing that got talked about. Was the last thing we steal what happens our wealth. So we must try to hold on to that as much as possible by taking stuff away. But it blew me away that this guy, this old white guy with this dark brown man in the face, and said, you don't think we just would easily just give up the turnover power to you?
And this wasn't in a Christian setting by any means, was it?
I said, well, I tell them all the time, that's your assignment, because I couldn't minister in an environment like that. Because once you show
I couldn't
me
either, and I'm an old white woman.
Once you show me that, and once you say that to me, my mind immediately goes to who else is in here thinking what you're thinking.
Yeah.
They're just not willing to say it. Like you talked about in St. Louis, right? Other places you go, racism exists in our country because it was place built on racism. You took something that didn't belong to you and called it yours.
That's right.
We won't teach it in history books, but that's the truth of the matter. So other places you go, it's more blunt. You can address it because it's in your face, and you can navigate it. Navigating it here looks different because some of it's up front, some of it's in the shadow, some of it is hid behind. I can't wait to hear all the details. I'm going to read bits and pieces about this.
It's so
law.
important.
But, you're spot on it. But I couldn't stay in that environment. I couldn't call that my church home. I couldn't, knowing that there are people walking around looking at me like that.
Yeah. So those aren't at least those people say it. The people that really scare me are like the people in rural Missouri who don't realize that they're voting against their own self-interest. They don't get that it's killing them to vote against Medicare expansion. They lost all their hospitals.
It's different and better.
I know, but they're used. They're being used. They're totally being used, and they're dying because they have no more hospitals. They have guns all over the place. They've got drugs, addiction. It's just outrageous that they think that little bit of whiteness they're holding on to is going to save them, and they're dying.
Oh, and our government,
that's
I have a
the
good friend
line.
who's from northwest corner of Missouri, and she talks about all the time in her hometown. They call him Point Fight because he was like, a sheriff, and he has no clue or idea, or shall I say, chooses not having an idea about what's best for the whole.
Oh, I know.
He's just concerned about
This piece of it.
this piece of it.
Yeah.
So,
The last piece of the teaching from this portion is, so is it, Kite say, is it really, is this really our nature? And our answer has to be no. Our answer has to be no. We have to believe that within every human being, there is a point of light that is good, right? There is a point of light that is good, and our job is to grow that light. And that's what this does. This, I believe, raises people's awareness and doesn't let that Secretary of State who sat in all of those, oh my God, all those meetings and lied to us, the governor who lies to us. They lied to us. They know, they have to know better. They can't be that stupid, you know, that they don't realize that we get what they're trying to do. Mm-hmm. So that's the grounding. We can do better, and that's why we are so grateful to be here, because this place sees the light in every human being. And that's what we're doing together, I hope, is growing that light. So that it's not when we go to war, but someday it'll be if, and there will be no more Amalek. Because we would have won.
well, I'm grateful we get to do this together.
You too. Thank you.
Very grateful.
Couple details about Ashrei. I think you know our mission. So we're a nonprofit of Central Reform Congregation. That one's me. That one's me. It's recording us.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. You can get to it if you need to.
I didn't mean to.
Help yourself. It is recording us in the back.
Oh my gosh. Sorry. I was just looking to see.
My husband and I do that
I was
all
looking
the
to
time.
see how that I talked too long.
No, we do that all the time. He picks
Oh
up
my
his
gosh.
phone and he's like, "Oh, this is yours," and I'm like, "Sorry." So we were formed out of Central Reform Congregation, building on these almost 40 years of legacy there. We the three primary chunks that we work in is empowerment, activation, and interruption. And so for me, empowerment is about not that sort of top-down empowerment of like, I'm going to bestow upon you some power and then you can come into it, but rather how do we, but like flipping that, how do we make sure that all of our community has the access, the information, the knowledge that then of self can come into power that is already inherent. I think activation is then sort of about taking, okay, now I'm like, ooh, like some little light has been on or fire is lit. Where do we go with that? How do we turn that into not just something that stays with self, but goes into something broader and collective? And then I think interruption are those places where we see Amalek coming and you have to stop it. You have to interrupt it and you have to figure out, that can look like a lot of different things, from interruption from an educational standpoint or interruption from a sit down, shut it down, close it off sort of civil disobedience style interruption, and everything in between and beyond. The arrow down here is sort of our, how are we going to do all of those things, is sort of through these 4 strategic levers, which is partnership investment, policy and advocacy, community building, and direct assistance. And so I think for me, this community building piece is about relationships. And we've talked about this since I think we came here. We can't do all of the other stuff unless we are intentionally sitting together and building those relationships and knowing each other so that we can find the ways that we can come closer together. Partnership investment, I think, is looking at how do we identify, or how are we invited into spaces where people are already doing things and there's a gap, and we can say, if someone could just invest maybe resources, energy, knowledge, experience, expertise, bodies in the whatever, how can we invest in what already exists? And I think when I came to Ashrei, this felt really important to me because I don't really think St. Louis needs another nonprofit organization that's coming up with some other solution to 1,200 problems in our city. Right. We need to figure out how to do what is happening maybe better, or maybe in more collaboration, or related to new groups and spaces of trust, right? I know that some people, for better or for worse, are going to trust Susan before they're going to trust me, before they're going to touch some guy from North City, right? Like, all across all the dissections and intersections. So how do we then figure out how we funnel that and make those connections in the right ways? Obviously, policy and advocacy, I think, is looking at some of the systems level ways that we need to shift things. And then I think the direct assistance piece felt really, from what I heard when I was, coming into this space, was looking at folks who were saying, okay, yes, we have to do systems, and yes, we have to do all these big things, and some people aren't going to be able to do that if they're trying to figure out how they put food on the table or get their health care or pay their bills, especially in St. Louis, where both the hot and the cold come after all of us all the time, and specifically against folks that don't have the privilege that I have. So I think these sort of, all four of these together is how we will exist. We have some 2022 annual goals. Mostly is about getting our feet off the ground and getting out of our own way so we can get some stuff done. This is our first year as a nonprofit. So we kind of went through this process and said, okay, let's make something happen. I don't want to do strategic planning for 4 years before we decide to act. Right. So how do we balance the let's plan, and also get out and go do. And so this is our attempt to do that. So in comes oh, great, we're doing planning. All of a sudden I'm in these calls and hearing all of these relationships, and then, oh, we think this is going to pass. Oh God, it passed. Oh my God, what is this going to be? And instantly it was like waterfall. Right. And so here we were, right in that unique spot to say, okay, let's listen, let's hear. And I was showing up in all kinds of spaces and hearing what was happening. So HB, House Bill 1878, modifies existing statutes about voting in Missouri. It was sponsored by Representative John Simmons, who's out by Washington, Missouri. He's a Republican, mostly in Franklin County. There's about half a dozen co-sponsors that signed up with him. No shocker, they're all Republican in Missouri. It was pre-filed in December, and I think this is important because in the state of Missouri, most of the legislative session is from January to May, but most bills that are going to come up in that session are pre-filed before that session starts. In December of this year, bills will be filed for January. That's important, I think, because it gives us a heads up. So right now, in other spaces, specifically about access to reproductive health care in Missouri, folks are already figuring out what's going to be introduced, and then that gives us a very small window of opportunity to strategize before the bills hit the floor and then start getting assigned to committee and vote and move through the whole process. So to me, it's okay, this was introduced for the 2022 session last year. This was had been introduced previously, or various versions and iterations of it. 1878 effectively took 30 different standalone types of pieces of legislation and smashed them all into one, not uncommon in Missouri legislature. And so this was not the first time these things had come up. They have in fact come up since at least 2016, and in some places had been struck down by the court after having gone through things and said, no, that makes it too hard for people who are eligible to vote to do so, and that violates Missouri Constitution and U.S. Constitution, so you can't do that, right? In different ways. But from December of last year until May of this year, it went through all those process and passed. And it got added to it, passed in May. In June, then it was signed, passes one side, passes the other side, complete bill, and then it gets sent to the governor, and the governor signed it. There was a moment where we were wondering whether or not the governor was going to sign it. A bill can become law in Missouri if the governor signs it or not. So if he signs it, then it is a faster process, but he could sort of take the I'm just not going to weigh in on that, and it will become law anyway. He can also veto it, which he clearly did not do. Became law, or passed, was official, became law in June 29th, and it didn't go into effect until August 28th, right? So I think this is a quote from Luz Maria Enriquez, who's the director of ACLU Missouri, who talks about voter ID laws. And I think there's some interesting pieces here. And I had a chance to be in Jeff City 2 weeks ago and heard Reverend Dr. Vernon Howard preach about this. And the way you look at not just, it's easy to dive so deep into this detail and this law. And he said, we got to get our heads out of our you-know-whats and look at the whole context of Black freedom struggle in the United States and the white supremacist struggle to defeat it and to stop it. And that is the context that this law is coming out of. And so in some ways, it's like stoking fear, reducing participation, both stoking fear among white, I would say, Americans predominantly, and reducing participation among Americans of color, who are then responding to this like fear of some problem that actually doesn't exist, right? Missouri doesn't have, and arguably nowhere in the United States, has a rampant history of abuse of elections and ballots, and people aren't casting all kinds of fraudulent elections and vote. We know this, and there's a huge narrative that believes that that's exactly what's happening. And so we have to protect and defend our democracy by enacting laws like this to make sure no one's abusing the right to vote. But it particularly, in that context then, disenfranchises people of color, people with limited income, rural Missourians, and voters with disabilities. These are the groups that this law specifically makes it harder than to vote. Here's how. So there's a lot of, again, I think the bill is like 80 pages or so long. So there's a lot of provisions of it. That last bullet point says, other harmful provisions include this like multitude of touches on early voting. It allows there's power grabs, right? It gives the Secretary of State a lot more power to take people off the voter registry. So there's statutes and laws that say when the governor or the Secretary of State can say like, oh, this signature doesn't match this, or this one is no longer valid, and so I can take you off the register, which means if I forgot to change where I was registered to vote or things like that, and I show up to vote, they're gonna be like, you're not registered, right? Because I wouldn't know, because my name was removed from the list. Expands that power and his ability to do that. There's reduction
so
of...
You can pick and choose who votes and who doesn't.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what some of us would say.
I mean, that's what it sounds like to me.
Yeah.
You get
That's
to sit
right.
in your office and go, yeah, you can
Exactly.
vote.
You can't.
That's right.
So-
Because, and that's why all the gerrymandering, I mean,
Right.
they're really strategic. They're
Right.
strategic in trying to keep their power.
Yeah.
They're a little white power in Chesterfield.
So when we dig into these three big chunks, voter registration, absentee voting restrictions, and photo ID, these are the spaces that becomes very clear to me that Amalek has a strategy. He's not just running up on us like, we're going to get it, right? It's like, okay, we sat in a room and we figured out exactly how we're going to pick off certain people of the voting population in Missouri. Here's how we're going to do it. And this is how they're doing it. First piece is voter registration. The law now says that no one shall be paid or otherwise compensated for soliciting voter registration. So all the volunteers, League of Women Voters, all of those groups that walk down Del Mar, that set up shop, that have volunteers in all kinds of events to say, I can help you register to vote. Here's a computer, here's the sheets, fill it out, I'll turn it in, I can mail it in, you can mail, whatever. All of that, no longer can you be paid or compensated. There's some questions here. Like, it hasn't been defined. What does it mean to be otherwise compensated? If I have a student group at Wash U who's registering students to vote and the campus minister buys them pizza for their sitting out on the plaza all day, is that compensation? And are they going to come after the students or the teacher or the campus ministry or all of it, right?
Yeah.
So this is concerning for that reason. There's also a space here that consolidates power in government offices, because the people who are exempt from this are if you're a government official. So a government official can go out and do all the voter solicitation and registration that they want.
Which they have no incentive to, because if I do that, then I'm inviting people into my space to vote me out.
Yes. Second piece of voter registration is that there's a registration requirement in order to solicit registration. So the other piece that hasn't been defined here is what constitutes soliciting. And in fact, in Jefferson City, at this conference a couple weeks ago, there were two gals from the Secretary of State's office who were saying, well, you can look up solicitation in the dictionary, and if you're just, helping people register, that's not soliciting. So if I put my laptop up and say, here you go, and I can talk you through how to register and whatever, those ladies were saying, but that's not solicitation. That's not what we mean. However, what they mean and what their interpretation of that is defined nowhere in statute. So is soliciting meaning I'm going to help you do it, or I'm going to pay for a stamp that goes on it, or you're going to use my phone and electrically sign your signature on the registry? am I soliciting that or not? But in order, so let's put aside the question about solicitation. If you're going to solicit 10 or more people to vote in any election cycle, you have to register with the Secretary of State. So what does that mean? I have to go online, I have to print a form, I have to manually sign it, and either fax, mail, or scan and email it back to them. I can't sign it online. I can't put a digital signature on it. I have to have an actual signature on a paper that I can either send an image of or send the actual thing to.
And let me guess, there's no defined timeline of when it has to be processed, or what the process is for getting the process, and who to contact if you don't get processed.
That's right.
Yeah. There's pieces in the statute about what defines an election cycle, and that you have to have it in there at one time during the election cycle. But to my knowledge, there aren't like, you have to do it 2 weeks before, or at least a day, or at least 6 months, or at least that level of detail, to my knowledge, isn't spelled out.
Which is extremely problematic. The other part that's not spelled out is who's responsible for overseeing it, because that can go into a black hole of email inbox and stay there,
That's right.
or a fax machine that never gets
That's
touched,
right.
or mail systems where someone can get lost.
And we had a lot of preachers in Jefferson City who were saying, no, but we do this in our church. We at the back of service, we have, solicitation, voter registration set up. And so are you telling me now I have to register as a solicitor, as the pastor, or each volunteer, each member of my congregation who's going to sit at the table, or who's going to hand out pens, or who's going to buy the stamps, or the one that mails them in, the next day? Who has to register and who's involved in the chain of command? A lot of that is left to be defined. The third piece is that only people who are allowed to register as a solicitor must be a Missouri registered voter over age 18. So that is going to cut out, a lot of things come to my mind. First thing that comes to my mind is that non-citizens who are actively involved in American society, who will never have a right to vote, can't even be involved in the democratic process by helping people who can vote do that thing.
I.e., the larger the immigration population we become, you just
Put them further out.
Of the democracy.
Wow.
Second thing is, I think about Americans who have been stripped of their right to vote. So if you are in a state that is banning the box, if you have a felony history that they have taken away your right to vote, you can't even be involved in you can't even touch the democratic process by helping people who can get there. You also can't be less than 18. I think about like high school kids and even some college kids who aren't 18 yet, who are anxious to participate in this whole thing, right? This is like the American narrative of like democracy. And we're saying, no, if you're too young, you can't even help people get into it.
So I wonder I guess if someone signs up to volunteer, they will check to see, or how is that?
How is it
do they
enforced?
determine?
How's it enforced? That's a great
Yeah, how
question.
is it enforced?
And see, it's been my experience in legal matters, right? And dealing with attorneys and, unfortunately, family history, that when laws are left vague, they're left that vague intentionally. It's just enough to put you on the hook, and just enough for me to hook you the way I want to.
That's right.
So that way, without
That's right.
being defined, if
That's
I
right.
just decide to show up
Right.
here tomorrow at the Tabernacle, and I see some stuff, I can then make it hard for you and get it tied up in court and wait for the judge to figure out how
Yep.
to enforce it.
Wow.
But meanwhile, I got you on the hook.
Exactly.
And you can't move. You can't do anything.
Or you're too scared to get into that you step away from it.
Yeah.
Wow.
I think the other thing that's real obvious along that line is that how they're going to do that is all of a sudden, if the 14th Ward in St. Louis or the 4th Ward, where are we, the 4th Ward, starts to suddenly have a huge voter registration increase, voter participation, voter turnout, things that should be celebrated in U.S. democracy,
They'll come out.
they're going to come
Come
look.
out and,
They're going to come start looking.
Yeah, and they'll come out in plain clothes.
Uh-huh.
And here's what they'll do. This is how a Abimelech will look. It will be somebody brown who's bought into their views,
Yeah.
who you would not suspect, who will roam the halls and then go back and make
And go back and make a
report.
report.
That's how that goes.
The last piece that I would say about voter registration is that violations, so if we say there's this whole hook thing, let's say you get got on this, the violations are misdemeanor charges, but it can also lead to a temporary restriction of your right to vote. So they can't totally strip it, they can temporarily restrict it.
Here's something else that sticks out to me too. Between Washington School, you're talking 50,000 college students. Many of them are out of state, so you're telling them they can't help either.
Yeah.
Because the hoops they'll have to go through to become a Missouri registered voter in
Yes.
the first place.
We're getting there.
Right. Yeah.
Spot on. Okay, point 2, we'll make this
This is
one
a
brief.
lot.
I know, sorry. I'm ranting, I'm gonna reel it in. Absentee voting restrictions. So there's this other piece so we're talking about registering to vote. Once you're registered, you can then request an absentee ballot, right? And that's already been highly restricted in Missouri law, right? Has to be no more than 6 months, but no less than 2 weeks, blah, 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 right? There's all these sorts of things. It now forbids any individual or group or party from soliciting a voter to obtain an absentee ballot application. So if I volunteered at a nursing home and I wanted to help people who are registered voters in the nursing home get an absentee ballot, I can't do that. It's not allowed. Can't do that. Same thing here, except next step higher. Violation can be a felony conviction, fines or jail time, and permanent loss of voting rights. For helping people obtain or know about.
How is that not in violation, that second point of that absentee voting restriction? How is that not in violation of my constitutional rights as an American?
Many would argue that it is, and we'll get to that response next.
Okay. I just remember my days in class,
That's right.
political science.
Oh man, doesn't it feel so juvenile? I studied poli-sci in college, and I also remember thinking, like, oh my God, that's so great. And then I'm like, man, I really thought that's how it worked.
And then the world happens. You experience life and you go,
Okay, third piece is photo ID. We talked about that. So a couple things here, and we'll dive into it on the next slide. Basically, Missouri was already a photo ID to vote state. That's already a voter restriction. There had been times that similar laws to this had passed and were defeated in the judge, right? A judge said, that's unconstitutional. You're already saying you have to have a photo ID. That's already an obstacle and a barrier and a restriction. You can't make it more than that, and so we struck it down. Well, now it's back in the law here, passed again. Slightly different language. It removes several forms of ID that is used to vote, and limits that's a typo. Vote on August 28th, sorry. Limits the acceptable IDs for voting to the following: an unexpired Missouri driver's license, an unexpired non-driver Missouri ID, a federal passport, or military ID. So historically, up until August 28th, you could present just the ID issued by the local election authority.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest, that's what I used on August 2nd. They mailed it to me, has my ballot information on it. I was like, great, I don't have to remember anything else. I take this, you scan it on the thing, you go. That's out. Can't use that anymore. You can't use a utility bill. You can't use a student ID. You can't use your grandma whose driver's license, how long ago did your dad's driver's license expire? You can't use that anymore.
So,
He has no way
but
to
if
vote.
I'm not, if
Yes.
I'm not driving, or I don't necessarily need a current ID to
Do the things.
do the things I need to do. I just need something with my picture on
Yep.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I don't have the money to keep renewing it every time you change the
That's-
rules and all of that.
The other thing that many of us have challenged is that the Secretary of State in this law did not have to send out a mass mailer and tell voting Americans that the law has changed and they need to look out for this. The Secretary of State has no obligation to Missouri registered voters to say this changed. Here's what you have to know the next time you vote. Okay, so what happened? First thing is there's sort of, the way we've talked about it in some other partner spaces is, this is a both and response. One, we're going to fight like stuff to get these laws blocked, overturned, overruled, blah, blah, blah. And in the meantime, we're going to fight like, you know what, to make sure that people have the greatest access within these laws as they currently exist. So number one, there were 2 lawsuits that were filed. The first one was filed by the League of Women Voters and NAACP Missouri Conference. It challenges those first two bullet points, the voter registration and the absentee solicitation provisions based on freedom of association and free expression in Missouri Constitution. Both of these are brought at Missouri Constitution level. The second one was brought by also Missouri Conference of the NAACP League of Women Voters and two individuals that represent, those are people who won't be able to vote because of these new laws. And I just spoke to another woman last week who called me in tears. She said, I saw the flyer and it took me a long time to understand what she was saying because she was so upset. She said, I am physically homebound. I cannot leave my home. And now I can't get an ID. I have sent my son to the DMV multiple times. I've gone through all the letters. I've got Dr. This. I've called the Secretary of State. I've called the Motor Vehicles Department of Revenue. We've done all the things, and they say I have to physically go to the DMV to get an ID, and I can't do that.
And there are plenty of people who are homebound.
Plenty of people.
That can't do that.
Yeah.
Miss Quinn at 3863 Ashland Avenue is now homebound. She's lived in that house 67 years. Does no longer have the mobility. She gets in-home care between her children, grandchildren, and the nurse. She cannot leave that house.
We're taking away her right
Her
to
rights.
vote.
And I
asked
think
them
about
on each one of these blocks.
I
by
think
name.
about the history of what it took to
To
get
get that
not only voting for men of color, but voting for women.
Oh, yeah.
And like,
She can tell you all the history.
and now we're gonna say if you're too old, if you've been too hurt or wronged by every other system, we just don't even.
We just don't even care.
We just don't even care. Just
yeah.
right.
And we're not gonna come up with any medium to get to
Right.
you.
That
And think about all the veterans, all
Oh.
the people who served this country who are now can't vote. People who were willing to risk their lives and now can't vote.
So when I talked to Denise Lieberman, who's a civil rights attorney, runs the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, she's the principal attorney for these lawsuits. She said they're hoping for a hearing scheduled by the end of September that will determine whether or not the judge will put a temporary injunction to block these provisions while the cases are heard and argued, right? It's going to take a while. They're not going to have a decision, for several months, if not, hopefully several months. But we will see if they will pause it, if a judge will say, there's enough here to stop this from going into effect before the general elections, right? Or not. So we don't know yet.
Right.
And if he says no, then we have to ramp up all the efforts between the end of September. Voter registration deadline, I think, is October 12th for the November general elections. We're going to have this much time.
To get those.
So by these rules, then, we are considered solicitors.
Some would argue that we are considered solicitors if a pastor or volunteers are helping people register to vote. According to the two women who sat with us in Jefferson City from the Elections Office Division of the Secretary of State, they said, unless you are retaining the ballots and you as an individual are turning them in or mailing them in, you're not soliciting. So if I show a laptop, if I give someone a stamp and they put it in the mailbox, that's not me soliciting. Attorneys in the room were like, show me where. Show me where it says that. And they were like, well, that's just, you can just look it up in the dictionary. And they were like,
No. That's why we have a constitution, because oftentimes
Right.
terms in the constitution are defined differently than the Webster's dictionary.
especially if you do it and if I do it, let's own that, right? If I start gathering names and signatures and registering people to vote, that's going to be very different if you do it, right? I mean, this is how it's set up. You know this.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
right now, all those provisions are in effect. So what do we do? We can speak briefly about this because I think all four of us know this already, but there was a history here, right, between TCDC and College Church's outreach program. College Church's program has been in effect since 1993, which is crazy for me to think about. Like, that's so long, helping people get documents they need. They serve about 60 people each month. They have weekly clinics. They spend over $50,000 a year paying for people to get birth certificates and photo IDs, which some people need as an end of themselves, right? For some people, and I would say for a lot of folks, for example, that we saw on August 25th right here, people didn't come here because they're dying to vote, right? Let's be honest. A lot of people are feeling like it's not worth it for me to vote anyway. So that's a whole other conversation. But people need an ID to get their kids in school, to sometimes get health care, sometimes open a bank account, right? Like for all these other things. So basically, TCDC had worked with College Church last year and done a clinic here. And I think what I heard was that it was maybe a one-time thing as a model makes it really hard because people don't know to expect it, right? It was like a one and done, and then what, right? Yeah. Versus College Church, who says, I'm going to be here every Tuesday from this time to this time. So we sat together with Alisha and Christine and said, okay, what does it look like? Is there still a need? Do people in this area and people that are in relationship with TCDC and Tabernacle Church is there desire for it, right? And B, if there is, how do we connect those dots? And after working with Christine, she said, you know what? I don't think you need to be so integrated with us that you are our program. That makes it harder. She said, what I want to do is give you what you need to run this. And in fact, I will add, since we started it, we were like her pilot program for how to equip others to do it. I'm now co-leading a training with them next week to teach pastors and clergy and everybody else across the state of Missouri. People are emailing me. I'm the newest one on this team. And they're like, how did you do this? How do you set this up? Do you have a training? And I was like, So we're partnering now to help other people figure out how to do exactly what you and I are figuring out how to do.
That's great.
Okay, so then the other thing here, we can do some quick highlights from our last clinic. On August 25th, we saw 21 clinic guests. The majority were female, majority identified as a person of color. 52% of guests are under 40 years old, which at face value, I was like, really?
It was a lot of young.
It was a lot of young people.
Wow.
Which is interesting to me, but also at the flip side, like maybe not. Those are the people who are
targeted.
Yep. Exactly. We cover the cost of 20 Missouri birth certificates, 6 photo IDs, and 4 out-of-state birth certificates, and we gave out 72 bus fares. The bus fares we were being pretty liberal with because people need a bus fare, and I don't actually know. I had a heck of a time with the Metro St. Louis trying to figure out, like, if you're going to go from here to City Hall, I imagine there's going to be a transfer somewhere along the way.
Yeah.
And so do I need another fare for the transfer? Because there was a whole COVID thing where, like, they weren't charging for transfers. Right. It was just one. We gave everyone, like, one person got $4 of bus fare.
Is there any way, I love that.
Yeah.
To take that graphic
Yep.
and put it on social media so that people see.
Isn't it on your page already?
It is, and
Okay,
I keep
so
trying to
I'll
tag you, but I don't know if I'm tagging you right.
Okay, I can share it.
Okay. Well, let's circle back on that.
I want to educate people because there's some knucklehead ministry leaders and pastors who I want to see this.
Okay, I'll share it.
And then once you share it, I'm going to grab it and then I'm going to have a nice fireside chat with a few.
Okay.
And I probably have, if you have other questions this is just some random cuts of data that I took, right? Like if you want to know how many people are over 60, I can tell you that. This is sort of my take on, like, here's some numbers that I can pull together.
I think this is a great capture of the day and who served.
Yep.
And tells the story of why.
Yep.
That's my biggest thing.
Great.
Well, what we might want to add to that is it doesn't say where we were. It should say Tabernacle Community Development Organization.
Okay.
It should say it on there.
Yep.
If you're going to send that graphic out, maybe put both Tabernacle and also College Church.
Okay.
Graphics on there.
Yep. I have Tabernacles at the bottom next to ours.
Oh, sorry.
But
I see it. Sorry.
No.
I see it now.
I can also send you the Canva, Alisha, so that you can modify it or change it or whatever. Doesn't feel proprietary to me, so I'll give it to you whatever you want.
Because I think, this is beyond. To me, this is beyond unconstitutional. This is just flat out mean, wicked, and evil.
Here's the thing. When we were sitting, again, in Jeff City, and on some of the calls with the secretary himself, he said, we've got people and we've got money. You tell us if there's a community need, and we'll send people out there to help your folks get an ID. And we'll process all the documents for them. They'll still have to go to the DMV, but we'll do everything that your clinics are doing, and we'll pay for it.
Not only that, he said, I heard him at a meeting of clergy with Gray and that whole group say, we don't think this is a problem. We think maybe it's a few people that are affected by this. He said that.
He said it.
Actually,
And then he said, in 2017, when this Show It to Vote program started, he said, we were out and I was out doing clinics and people just weren't coming. There just wasn't a need. And then he had the gall to smirkingly say, maybe it's just, maybe it just wasn't a good idea for, a guy that looks like me to be out there doing this.
Oh, you think?
And I thought to myself, A, you're a rich white politician. B, people don't trust you or the government that you represent. So absolutely not. You're not the right guy to be doing.
Not only that, you went to no urban areas of Kansas City, St. Louis, or even Columbia. Because quiet as kept, I went to school in Missouri. It had its own little sect of deep urban troubles. And the university and others tried to put lipstick on and cover up. You didn't go to any of those areas. And if you were really sincere about doing it and paying for it and processing, you would have been doing it long ago before this ever became a thing. So all of that is political jargon. You don't care about it.
They have a website and you can call, and it's literally one woman. It's a statewide program. And it's one, I said, who answers the call? And she said, I do. I was like, I'm sorry. You got one person for the whole state who's going to answer calls and emails of people trying to access a free ID to vote, and you're going to process them all? You're going to do all of that? And Christine then called and asked some more questions, and she said, basically, if you call, they'll mail you things, then you have to mail things back, then they'll apply, then they'll mail back to you. It's going to take 6 months minimum for them to generate any sort of document or produce any sort of thing. So talk about a veil of pretending to do something helpful. Anyway, ranting. Our next clinic, is September 10th, this Saturday, in conjunction with the resource fair, which is exciting. Next steps, we'll close out. I have sent a poll we've trained 60 volunteers so far. I have sent a poll to kind of ask when volunteers would be most convenient for them to sign up for weekly office hours. I want to be able to say, we'll be here on Wednesdays or Thursdays from X time to X time, and I'll be here and I'll have volunteers here and people can schedule appointments. I think the clinics we're going to keep doing on a monthly basis, so we'll set October, November. We'll see if we need to do a December 1 or whatever. I think those should be walk-in only, gives people just come in and do it, whereas if you want to do it during the week, then we can offer some appointment spaces.
Love it. And once that's set, we'll put it on the Hub's website.
Great.
So people will know.
Great. We are going to continue to offer volunteer training, so I'll probably do another one. If I can find a time to do it before the end of September, I will, but I have told people I'm not doing it before September 10th, y'all, there's no time. But after that, and people want to know, they want to come to a training. And then we are going to continue to collaborate to train other groups across the state of how to do this. So our first one for that is Monday, September 12th. And then we're going to start on Ashrei end figuring out how to fundraise the sustainability of this. Right now, we made a decision, and our board made the decision that this was important to make it happen now. And so we're fortunate to have a donation that can support us doing this now without trying to make budgets and apply for a grant and then get money and then start this program in 6 months, right? This is a do it now. But I think, and we'll see, we could be totally wrong by the end of this year, but my sense is that this is going to be a sustained need. I have 6 calls from this weekend of people asking, can I get an appointment for next Saturday?
Yeah, we're getting
My knee-jerk reaction was like, yeah, I'm not answering the phone on a weekend. But my other reaction was like, okay, I'll get you. So. Mm-hmm.
So there are 2 groups too that keep the unhoused. There are people who are unhoused who can't get jobs because they don't
have an ID.
So it's the stumbling block.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the things we're going to try.
Yep.
Can maybe get a team that goes to some of the shelters and works with the shelters. And the other thing you made me think about is, Yeah, what if we had a team that goes to shut-ins?
Yeah.
The people that you know in the neighborhood. That's another
Yep.
idea, is we
Yeah.
create a team that, with a neighborhood person, maybe Alisha would like identify somebody who would go with some of our volunteers to this
Yep.
woman, we could go to shut-ins and say, how we can help you.
Yeah.
Instead of, because they can't come here, but we could do that too.
Last week I met with, in that vein, a caseworker from Mission St. Louis called me and said, I work with this unhoused man and he doesn't have ID, and can you help him? And I said, sure. And so we had to be flexible because he wasn't where he said he would be at the time that his caseworker was going to pick him up. And so they showed up a few hours later, and this man, the other thing that we talk about in this space, people who are shut out by this law have also been, in my limited experience, historically and systemically shut out, and they are so unaccustomed to walking into a space, someone shaking their hand, someone saying, Mr. Russ, I said, and he was like, I thought he was going to have a heart attack, because I just said, like, hey, Mr. Russ, like, nice to meet you, Bill. He looked at me like I had he couldn't believe that I addressed him, and I was like, bro, chill, right? Like, this is kind of standard for me. I didn't say, like, sir, but, like, and having someone sit with them and creatively, we had to be creative. I pulled up his selective service registry online so that I could print that as one of his forms of documents, so he could get his birth certificate. And once he gets his birth certificate, he'll be able to get an ID. And it's like all of that for one person who had a caseworker dedicated enough to go pick him up, bring him to me, who had a caseworker who was informed enough to find out about, I can only imagine the actual magnitude of
I used
this reality.
work for a program that served it, so it's that multiplied by thousands, I can tell you.
Well,
The other piece I think about is those who are in either senior living facilities or nursing homes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If you're telling me that in order to get an absentee deal, I gotta go to the DMV and get if I'm in a nursing home and I can still move around, but I don't have a current ID for what? Like, I don't need
Right.
it.
I really need it.
I don't need it.
Right.
right. My dad, 96, voted every year he could of his life, served in World War II, has a expired New York driver's license, because I moved him here. What do you need it for? Expired passport. He's not going anywhere. And his birth certificate doesn't have his name on it, because he was born in 1926.
Oh, wow.
And they just called him male.
Male.
So he can't, for the first time in his life, he can't go to vote.
I think the other next steps here are staying engaged. So in this time period where we don't actually know if there's going to be an injunction or not, the laws do say you can register people to vote, but the safest way to do it is don't get paid and compensated, no gifts, no rewarding. If you're going to do a thing in the back of church, don't give your people anything. Maybe there happens to be a pancake breakfast down the hall, but don't at all attach it to supporting the volunteers or the members, right? And the second thing, register everyone as a solicitor. You can fill out the forms if you're going to have your voting committee or whatever, print the forms, have them sign it, mail it in, and call it good. Just, especially you as the pastor, I would say, if you're going to have this here, that's what we've heard is just register as a solicitor and
I'll definitely
cover your butt, And then the third piece is advocacy, of course. I think for me, there's two parts of advocacy. One is we got to change these laws, obviously. And I think two, related to that, we have to address this fact that many people, including, I would say, people my age and younger especially, don't feel like it matters. And I've been in that boat too, of like, well, what am I going to vote for this for? Like, it's not going to matter. I know how this politics works anyway. And until and unless we start showing up collectively over and over and over, they're going to continue to we are letting them have that power that we want to have. They are right, to circle back to what you said at the beginning, they're not just going to give it up that easy. And I think there's an old organizing principle that said, power is never given, it is always, you only have this, I'm going to look it up. And I will email it to you because no one ever gives away power. You always have to take it. And so if we're trying to readjust that, to change what the state of Missouri looks like, to change what St. Louis City looks like, right? Even I just had a conversation about lawns and cutting grass, and every time I drive here, I look at lot after lot of like what I would assume is now city-owned property, of stuff that I'm sure they have collected on. It's 4 feet high of overgrown nonsense. Anyway, if we don't do it, they're going to keep doing it exactly as they are. And so we have to figure out, as pissed and as angry as we might feel and as worthless as it might seem, we have to do it until they can't ignore us anymore. So that's the presentation for today.
Wow, this is great. Thank you. It connects the dots. Like I said, I had to read bits and pieces, whether it's articles or read some stuff and said it's American, but now this helps me understand the pieces. It helps me understand the lawsuits. I'm praying that this injunction works.
Yep.
And I agree. I see this is something that's going to escalate because you figure this is midterms. Wait till we get to 2024.
And that's what I think. We had a conversation earlier this year of like, actually our second training, which was at Cope Brilliant, somebody said, but aren't we too late? And I said, hold on. Hold on here. Like, we have got to play a way longer game than that. Because this one matters and the next one will matter and all the things in between matter. But I know I'm going to get beat in 2 months. That's fine. I now have 2 years to figure out whether or not we're going to build enough power. So what are we going to do between now and then? And how do we sustain this and build this then? So.
We've got to be in the long game.
Yeah.
We're in the long game.
Definitely have to be, because if not, because rest assured, they're in it for the long game. So in between this midterm and that presidential election, they're going to keep looking for ways to enhance, they'll call it, registration laws.
That was one thing.
They're not going to stop.
Yeah. That was one thing I remember hearing Vernon Howard talk about. He went through this whole history. I'll look for my notes and share them with you if you want my chicken scratch. But he went through a whole history of the Black freedom struggle, and he said, look at this thing. We rose in this moment, and they cut our legs off in this moment. And we rose in this moment, and then it was shot down in this moment. And this is another one of those moments. And if we don't have you ever listened to Vernon Howard preach? So you can imagine, give that man a mic, and we're sitting in a little conference room in a hotel. He's standing up and his sweat's flying everywhere. He's screaming, and literally this man stands up and jumps. I don't know if you've ever seen him. He's kind of a round, bald-headed, very present man, and there is a lot of sweat when he is preaching, and it is exciting and thrilling. And he was jumping up and down in his suit and the microphone saying, "Stand up and vote," at the end of it, and everyone in that room. I mean, it's like, even now, it's like, it lights you. But how do we do that? Because I can't get everyone in a room with him. So, like, how do we do that in a way that matters?
And that's why I want that graphic. Because in my mind, when I put it on my page, I'm not soliciting, I'm educating.
Yep, same.
And I'll bring my team of lawyers to you.
Yes.
Telling you I'm in the business of educating. So, you can't stop me from educating.
That's right.
You can't stop me Sunday morning from educating our congregation.
That's
Here's what the announcements are for today. Let me educate you on this graphic and why this matters.
Yep.
I'm not soliciting, I'm teaching.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
So, don't be doing a lot of teaching.
Great. Tell me what you need, and I'll get it to you. I'll definitely make sure you have
This was really good.
the graphic.
Yeah, I mean.